Chapter 17. Magwitch and his Dear Boy. Magwitch was finding it increasingly difficult to breathe because of a wound on his chest. He had received the wound as well as a cut on the head when Hamburg steamer had swept over him. I held him in my arms, and he explained in gasps and whispers how he and Campisan had hit the waters, entangled in each other's arms. There was a fierce struggle, and Magwitch had managed to break free. The boat kept on encircling the area where Campisan had been spotted last, but he was nowhere to be seen. This body was discovered later lying along the bank. We rowed back to the inn after some time, where I was permitted to purchase dry clothes for Magwitch. But there were strict instructions by the officer in charge, the same man who had hailed us and had been steering the other rowboats. He said that all the belongings of the prisoner, which included Magwitch's cash and wet clothes, must be taken back to London and handed over to the authorities. I knew that this would upset Magwitch a great deal, so I withheld this information from him. I sat beside my wounded benefactor instead, held his hand and urged him to preserve his strength, but nothing could stop him from speaking. "Dear boy of mine," he began, "I knew I was taking a risk returning to England, but I just had to see you. I did so, and I am glad now. My dear boy can be a gentleman without me now, but it is best that a gentleman seem to have no connection at all with the likes of me. Please, maybe sit in the courtroom where I can see you, dear boy, and I don't ask for nothing more," he stated. "No," I exclaimed. "I shall never desert your side as long as they allow me to be with you. May the Lord allow me to be as true to you as you have been to me." I felt his hand shiver as I said this. He smiled and fell asleep soon after. Magwitch's trial turned out to be very small and precise. Mr. Jaggers was his defense lawyer, but he had forewarned me that the case was a lost battle. Even the presentation of Mr. Jaggers' affidavit that Magwitch had rehabilitated and had transformed himself into a rich man of respectability in New South Wales, Australia, did not suffice. The fact of the matter was that he was still a convict who had come back despite being warned that doing so amounted a death penalty. As the judge passed this death sentence on him, all Magwitch said to him was, "My Lord, I have received the death sentence from the Almighty, but I bow to your sentence." I was desperately wishing and praying too that Magwitch would die before the death sentence could be carried out. Fearing that he might not, I wrote repeated appeals to almost everyone in the authority who might be able to help. I put on paper his whole story as well as mine, with the hope that it might help this case. I also followed these appeals with personal visits. I was permitted to visit Magwitch every day in the prison hospital. He was deteriorating gradually and did not speak much. His only response to acknowledge my presence would be a slight, weak pressure on my hand as I held his. I observed a change come over him on my 10th visit. His eyes lit up brightly as I entered. "Dear boy," he whispered, "you are always the first visitor in the ward. I always wait for the gate before they open, so that I won't miss a single moment of time spent with you," I replied honestly. "Thank you, dear boy. You have never deserted me, never," Magwitch stated emotionally. I was quiet as I pressed his hand. How could I forget that I had once planned to desert him? "What is the best is," he spoke on, "that you were by my side when I was under this dark cloud rather than when the sun was shining. That's worth everything to me." Magwitch had trouble breathing now, and a dark shadow seemed to descend on his features all of a sudden. "Are you in too much pain?" I asked softly. "I never complain, dear boy," he replied. Those were exactly his last words, as he made a feeble gesture with his hand, which signified that he wanted me to lay my hand on his chest. I did so, and he covered my hand with both of his. The bell rang shrilly, just then to proclaim the end of the visiting hours. The prison doctor, who had also entered at the same time, examined Magwitch and shook his head resignedly. Then he placed his hand on my shoulder and gestured that I should remain sitting where I was. It was clear to me that Magwitch was close to death, and I leaned forward towards him. "Dear Magwitch," I said softly, fighting hard to control the sea of emotions ranging over me. I was close to tears now. "I must tell you something at these last moments. Do you understand what I am saying?" He pressed my hand to indicate that he could. "You had a child once upon a time, a child whom you lost," I stated. The pressure on my hand intensified. "She was not killed as you dreaded. Instead, she lived and discovered powerful friends. She is alive today. She is a very beautiful lady indeed, and I am in love with her," I said softly. Magwitch lifted my hand to his lips with a rather strained effort, kissed it, and let it fall back on his breast, where his hands covered it again. A serene look crossed his features, and his head dropped silently to one side. Magwitch was dead. I was not terrified to witness death at such a close quarters. I felt as tranquil as the quiet, aged face on the pillows. I had not been true to Joe Gargary and his friendship, but I had found the strength of heart deep within me to be true to Magwitch and remain his dear boy till the very end. Chapter 18. Changes aplenty. When I was finally able to focus my attention on my own affairs, I discovered that I was in a terrible mess. I was deeply in debt. a result of which I had to sublet my expensive rooms till my lease had expired. Herbert had already left for the East for his assignment to manage Claricus' new branch office in Cairo, the capital of Egypt. Before his departure, Herbert had guaranteed that a position of some kind would always exist at that branch for me. However, I was incapable of arriving at a concrete decision about my life, and I was falling sick. A serious illness had been threatening to possess me for many weeks now, but I had managed to keep it at bay till Magwitch passed away. Now a fever descended on me and caused aches all over my body as I lay on my bed, shivering. There were times when I would gather my strength to snap out my hallucinations and walk in the streets aimlessly. I regained my senses one day, still burning with fever, to discover two men looking down at me as I lay on the street outside my house. "Who are you? What is it that you want?" I croaked. "We have come to arrest you for debt, sir," one of them answered. I moaned and tried to get up, but my legs buckled under the pressure. "I would have come to see you if I was not as ill as I am," I exclaimed. They moved across the street and debated with each other, but left finally. I managed to stumble into the house, but my condition deteriorated further as the fever and the nightmares returned with a vengeance. All the people I had known in my entire lifetime appeared to be sitting in a queue beside my bed. I raved and ranted, screamed and vomited, and slowly the group of people gathered by my bedside began to fade away. Only one person still remained. It was Joe. Somehow the hand that sponged my hot face with cool water always seemed to belong to Joe. The face that looked at me with a compassionate expression always seemed to belong to Joe. "Is it Joe?" I managed to ask in a weak voice finally. "That it is, dear old Pip," Joe's welcome voice replied. I began to cry like a child, not in a hallucinatory way, but in my full senses. "Strike me, Joe. You have full reason to be angry with me. Tell me how I double-crossed our friendship. Please, don't be so nice to me." But Joe was so beside himself with happiness that I had recognized him, that he knelt beside my bed and gave me a warm hug. "You and me always friends, Pip," he said, as his own eyes brimmed with tears. "Now be calm and get well soon." Joe nursed me for the entire month. I do not recall the length of my illness before that period. All I could recall is that I recovered from my sickness and got back my strength gradually. It was just like the times we had spent together in the old days in the house on the marshes. I imagined I was little Pip once again, as Joe addressed me with the same old simplicity and took care of me in that characteristic protective way of his. One afternoon, when Joe had ascertained that I was good enough to take in the news, he informed me that Miss Havisham had succumbed to her burns. She had left behind all her money to Estella as expected. I tried to tell him about my own great expectations and about my mysterious benefactor as well, now that the topic had been raised. I wanted him to know that Miss Havisham was not my benefactor as the supposition was. But Joe interrupted me to say that he had heard something about certain events, that it was an unimportant matter between friends. Then he leaped up to prepare our evening meal and ended our conversation. Joe left me when it became evident that I had recovered fully. He stole away one morning, leaving behind a badly spelt and a stained farewell note. Biddy had taught him to read and write, and he had taken great pride in informing me about his achievement of his. A paid receipt for the debt which had led to my arrest was enclosed with the Joe's note. This was in Joe's name. I had not allowed myself to think about this particular creditor, in the hope that he had decided to withdraw his court proceedings till a time when I had regained my health. It was beyond my wildest imagination that Joe had paid off my debt. I sat down with a thud, holding Joe's smeared note and the receipt in my hand, as I reflected upon the stupid and self-centered life of my recent years. Then I recalled the fresh, clean air that would rise from the river and blow over the marshes where I had been brought up. Biddy's sweet and mature faces kept appearing in front of my eyes. She had been my close friend and confidante ever since she had arrived in our house after the attack on my sister. What better way is there to rectify my life than to marry Biddy? I said to myself. I will demonstrate to her how regretful and humble I am. I will ask her to marry me and take the decision as to what our future should be. If it is her wish that I work at the forge with Joe, I shall do so. If she wishes that I should take up some alternative occupation in the village or in the country, I shall agree with her. I will consult her about Herbert's offer, and we shall leave for Egypt together if that is her wish. 3 days later, I boarded the coach bound for Kent. The weather in June was lovely. The sky was magnificent blue, and the larks flying high above the green corn in the fields lifted my spirits too. As I approached the forge, I did not hear the sound of Joe's hammer. A sudden rush of fear filled my senses as the forge was shut. The house thankfully was not empty. A fresh white curtains fluttered out as if they waved at me from the open window of the parlor. I rushed to the window and looked inside. Joe and Biddy stood together, arm in arm. They exclaimed loudly and joyfully on spotting me and rushed to embrace me. Biddy looked so radiant and happy that I embraced her again. Dearest Pip, now that you are here, it makes my wedding day just perfect. Joe and I have just been married, Biddy informed me happily. I managed to offer my heartiest congratulations to them without expressing my disappointment. I also managed to spend many hours with the delightful couple before forcing myself to take my leave from them and rushing back to London. I sold all that I had there and made arrangements so that my creditors could be paid off bit by bit. I decided to travel to Egypt after that where I took up a position with Clerical and Company as a clerk. Herbert and Clara had married, and I lived with them. I managed to rise in the firm and paid off all my debts as a result. I was also living well within my means. I also ensured that I wrote regularly to Joe and Biddy. After several years, I managed to become a partner with Clericus and Company. Our firm was not the largest firm in the true sense of the word, but we enjoyed a good reputation and made a substantial profit. But one day, Clarica could no longer hide the secret of Herbert's partnership from him anymore, and he informed Herbert how it had come about. At this stage, Herbert's ability would have easily sufficed for him to buy a partnership, but my money had done the needful when he had needed it most. Herbert loved me for it. Chapter 19. After 11 years. It took 11 years for me to return to England. It was an hour after dark on a December evening when I silently pushed open the kitchen door of the house on the marshes. There was Joe smoking his pipe by the fire. He had not changed much and was only a little grey. Seated on my own small old stool opposite Joe was a little Pip. Joe leapt up to welcome me back and touched me again and again to ensure that it was me. But the little boy held back. Biddy dashed in and cried as she kissed me. In the space of a couple of days, young Pip, he had been named after me after all, and I became good friends. We went for regular walks on the marshes, and I showed him the tombstones of my family. In order to comprehend his feelings and thoughts in a better way, all I had to do was recall my own thoughts when I was his age at this very place. By the time I departed from their house, little Pip was so fond of me as I had been of his father when I was young. He stood by the forge and kept waving at me till I was out of his sight. I went to have a last look at the site where Miss Havisham's house had stood before the fire had occurred. Unfortunately, nothing remained of the burned-out house with the sole exception of the garden, which resembled wild growth invading into the areas once occupied by the house. I went through the old gate, which was no longer locked, and sat down on a stone bench. Thoughts of Estella still dominated my mind. I had come to know that her married life with Bentley Drumley had not been very happy. In fact, it had turned so sour that she had to leave him. I had also heard that he had died in a riding accident soon after she had left him. But all these had occurred 2 years ago, and perhaps Estella had married again. I walked aimlessly deeper into the garden, which looked barren and forsaken in the wintry air. Suddenly I spied the figure of a woman standing forlornly in the moonlight. She had turned to face me as she heard the sound of my approaching footsteps. Instant recognition dawned on both of us simultaneously. "Stella!" I cried as I ran towards her. "I have changed a lot, Pip," she whispered. "It is a miracle that you still recognized me." It was true that freshness of youth had faded, but she had managed to retain the splendor and the charm of her beauty. Her haughty eyes were replaced by a soft, melancholy look. We sat down together on a bench, and I asked her if she visited the place often. "No, I came here for the first and the last time. I wanted to bid adieu to the place. This property was the last thing I possessed, and I have sold it," Estella replied. Do you still live abroad, Pip? She inquired. I updated her about my partnership with Clarica and Company, and that pleased her greatly. I have thought of you often, Estella confessed. There was a time when I could not bear the thought of you. The fact that I had discarded your love due to my ignorance for upsetting for me. But now, she smiled gently, I have given it a special place in my heart. You have always had a special place in my heart, I said gently, taking her hand in mine. We sat there in complete quietude for a while before Estella broke the silence in a low voice. The agony which I have suffered so many years ago has proved to be the strongest teacher among all my other teachers. I have been bent and broken, and I hope I have been molded into a better shape. As I must part from you again, I am happy in a way that our parting is taking place here, because this is a place I must also say goodbye to. I sincerely hope that you have forgiven me and will be as kind towards me as you once were. I hope that we shall part as friends. We are friends, I said, little forcefully. But as for parting, all I can say is that remains to be seen. She rose from the bench, her hand still in mine, and we walked away slowly. Estella and I walked away together, leaving the shadow of Miss Havisham behind us forever. End of the story.